This video presentation about slave revolts by me, Victoria Poole, is just some of the many slave revolts that happened throughout history that I thought deserved some attention. The definition is an attempt to put an end to the authority of a person or a body by rebelling. The first rebellion that I'm going to tell you about is Nat Turner's Rebellion of 1831. Nat Turner was born on a Virginia plantation of Benjamin Turner. He was taught to read, write, and he was taught religion. He was sold 3 times in his childhood and eventually hired out to John Travis. He and others planned a revolt that had to be pushed back for August 21st, 1831. He and 6 other slaves joined ranks and killed the Travis family. They managed to get weapons and horses. He and about 75 other slaves sided with him, and it resulted in the murder of 51 white people that night. Turner was found 6 weeks later, and he was hung and skinned. This was considered the first effective slave revolt in America. His and other slaves' actions set off new legislation prohibiting the education, movement, and the assembly of slaves.
Be my woman, girl, I'd be your man. Be my woman, girl, I'll be your man. Be my woman, girl, I'll be your man. Get this $100 in your hand, Lordy, in your hand. Get this $100 in your hand. Stick to the promise, girl, you made me. Stick to the promise, girl, you made me. Stick to the promise, girl, you made me. But God married till I go free.
The next slave that I am going to tell you about is the Stono Rebellion of 1739. On September 9th, 1739, South Carolina was shaken by a slave uprising. It was a band of 20 slaves organized by a man named Jemmy on the banks of the Stono River. The group broke into the local store called Hutchins. The group was then armed with weapons. They went and killed their overseers, and the reluctant slaves were forced to join them. The group reached the Edisto River, where a group of white men met them and started firing back at them. This led to the eventual death of 60 people that day. Those slaves that survived were sold off to the West Indies, and this rebellion led to the stricter rules of white men and how they were to treat their slaves.
Be my woman, girl, I'd be your man. Be my woman, girl, I'd be your man.
The next revolt I am going to discuss is the Amistad Ship Revolt of 1839. In 1839, 53 African natives were kidnapped from Eastern Africa and sold into the slave trade. They were then placed aboard a Spanish slave ship bound for Havana, Cuba. They were sold as native Cuban slaves and purchased at auction by 2 Spaniards. The slaves were then shackled and loaded aboard a cargo schooner named the Amistad. 3 days into their journey, a slave named Seng Pe broke out of his shackles and released the others, and the slaves attacked. They killed most of the crew of the Amistad, including the captain. The government charged the slaves with piracy and murder, and they were sent to prison pending their case before the court in Hartford, Connecticut. Their case was important, very controversial, and highly political. The Spanish government pressured the U.S. to return the slaves to Spain without trial. The Supreme Court eventually dismissed their case, and they were sent back to Africa. The next revolt is Gabriel's Conspiracy of 1800. On August 1800, a horrible storm aborted one of the most extensive slave plots in American history. It is known to hundreds of slaves throughout central Virginia. A blacksmith slave named Gabriel had planned to go to Richmond to the Virginia State Armory and then hold Governor Monroe hostage to bargain for the freedom of Virginia's slaves. But the intensity of the storm delayed the group's planned meeting. A few of the nervous slaves decided to tell their master about the plot. The arrest of the group, including Gabriel, led to many trials. 26 slaves were hung and another committed suicide in his cell. Several convicted slaves were sold and transported out of Virginia. The 2 slaves who had told their masters about the intended rebellion were given their freedom. One of the largest rebellions of slavery in American history was the German Coast Uprising of 1811. It was also known as the Andrew Rebellion. On January 8, 1811, a slave by the name of Charles de Landes led an organized rebellion of slaves along the German coast of the Mississippi River. His group grew to an estimated 200 men. They ended up killing 2 white men, burning down 3 plantations and their crops, as well as gathering weapons along the way. Within 2 days, a militia of planters had been formed to respond to this threat. Attacking the enslaved African American men at the Distrahan plantation, they killed an estimated 40 enslaved revolters. Others were captured and executed, and an estimated 95 slaves were said to have been killed during this whole revolt. Delandes was never given a trial, nor was he interrogated. He had his hands cut off, and then he was shot in both legs and was put in a bundle of straw and burned alive. The Harper's Ferry attack of 1859 was one of the few slave revolts led by a white man. They were led by an abolitionist named John Brown. He led his group to raid the armory in Harper's Ferry and attempt to start a revolt to stop slavery. He gathered the support of 5 other major abolitionists, and together they were known as the Secret Six. But their numbers quickly grew to 22, including 3 of Brown's own sons. On October 16, 1959, Brown and his men took their armory and ended up taking hostages. The group was soon surrounded by Robert E. Lee and his troops. This ended up with 10 of Brown's men, including 2 of his sons, being killed. Brown was wounded, and he ended up being tried and convicted of treason and murder and sent to the gallows. His actions are believed to have helped escalate the tensions between the North and the South in the debate over whether slavery was ethical or not. The last slave revolt that I'm going to discuss is the New York Conspiracy of 1741. It is also known as the Negro Plot. Historians are unclear about how or why this rebellion began, but between March and April of 1741, 10 fires were set throughout New York City. On the last day alone, there were 4 fires set. A group of African Americans had started the fires to try and encourage the end of slavery and to kill as many white people as possible. Over 100 enslaved African Americans were arrested for burglary, arson, and insurrection. An estimated 34 people were imprisoned as a result of their participation in the New York slave conspiracy. 13 African American men were burned, 17 black men, 2 white men, and 2 white women were also hung. In addition, 70 African Americans and 7 whites were expelled from New York City.